My name's Molly Keck. I work for the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service in Bexar County in San Antonio, and my master's work was all on fire ants. So I feel like fire ants are the ant that is near and dear to me, and that I, at least at one time, knew the absolute most about. Um, and my email was there. If you guys have questions, you can always shoot me emails, but I'll have it also at the end of the presentation. So just a little background about fire ants. You know, they've been here for a very long time, so I think we can say that they're native, but truly they're not native. They are a stinging insect or a stinging ant, and so it's not a fire ant bite that hurts you, it's actually a sting. They're related to wasps and bees, and it's venom that hurts so bad. They're one of the they are the only ant that will leave that pustule as a minimal reaction that you will have. No other ant will do it. They, I say they're not native. They're native to like Paraguay and Brazil, and we believe that we got them. I used to know the date, and now I don't. I no longer know the date, but we believe that we got them around Mobile, Alabama first. And probably what happened was a ship sucked up a bunch of fire ants in its ballast, and then it dumped it out when it made it to the United States. They're a floodwater species, so they can float on top of the water, and they survive the whole trip from South America to North America. So they're also the only ants that we really have in Texas that are as aggressive as they are. So when you step on that mound or you irritate them, they want to hurt you and come after you. Whereas other ants generally just want to get the heck away from you if at all possible. And they will form these above ground fluffy mounds when it's really moist and the ground is more saturated with water. When it's really dry, those mounds go flat because they burrow deeper, but they're the only ant that makes that pillowy above ground mound, and they have no single hole that they come in and out of. They come all over the place. So like that guy stepped on that mound, that's going to hurt a whole lot later. They're going to be stuck all in his shoelaces, but they came from everywhere. They didn't come from a single entrance or exit hole. So that's the other big difference between them and other species of ants. And we have like 75 different species of ants in Texas, probably not that many in San Antonio, but pretty close to it. And the ones that generally get confused for fire ants are harvester ants, which you guys probably know as red ants. They're the ones that are the favorite food source or primary food source, or at least we believed they were, for the Texas horned lizard or the horny toad. But now they're finding, herpetologists are saying now that really they go after other things as well, and that might only be a small part of their diet. But we like to say it's a big part of their diet, because if you kill the fire ants, you help the harvester ants, and then you help the horned lizards, and everybody likes a good success story when you bring a threatened species back from the brink. They also, harvester ants will kind of clear out a huge area, and they usually like kind of like sandy soil. I always remember as a kid seeing them on softball fields and baseball fields, but they clear out a whole area, and then they have one single hole that they're coming in and out of, and they're pretty big ants. And then there's pyramid ants that make a very tiny craterish, but it can also seem to be a little bit fluffy. They, though, will have a little entrance or exit hole that they'll crawl in and out of. And they're not as big as fire ants sometimes, and they're not red and black in color. They're more honey colored, I think. And then leaf cutter ants, if you have them, you absolutely hate them. But if you don't have them, they're kind of a cool ant to look at. They seem very tropical, but we have it's a Texas species. Addatexana is the species, and they're in kind of, they're in San Antonio certainly, but they can be throughout the wetter parts of Texas, not really so much in West Texas, and into Louisiana also. But they have bunches of mounds, and they kind of crater in, and then there's big holes that they're coming in and out of, and they're stripping leaves, and you can see them carrying like little sails back into their nest. So just because you see an above ground mound doesn't mean it's a fire ant. But if it comes out of nowhere, there's no single entrance or exit hole, and they really want to hurt you, then you've got fire ants. So fire ants pose a lot of problems. They're considered a major pest. When I first started with Extension 15 years ago, we were funded on money from the state to do fire ant research and do fire ant education. And now I think people have just kind of cowboyed up a little bit, and we're used to them, because it's, you know, if you were born in Texas, or if you were born 60s or later, you have never lived your life without fire ants around. So we can kind of consider them native in that respect. But they're an issue, you know, agriculturally and medically. They'll get into electrical circuits and they'll, you know, stop the connections from happening, and they cause a lot of havoc there. They don't really chew on wires. They just clog things up. They're really bad with wildlife. They will attack usually deer and other things. Oops, sorry, I don't know why these are going in and out. Like when a new fawn is born, they're known to blind them because they will go after the gooey eyes and they'll eat the eyes and then sting it. Do the same thing with cattle. So they're a major problem across any aspect that you can think of, you know, any arena of life. They can be considered a major pest. And quail, they're also known to be a major problem for quail because they're ground nesting, and any ground nesting bird. But if you think about when that little baby comes out and it's really slimy, they love that kind of protein stuff. So they have caused some serious issues with bobwhite quail and other species of quail in Texas. And a lot of people always ask, you know, is eradication possible? And large scale, no. Small scale, probably. And there are a lot of other countries that are islands. Australia has put in billions of dollars to try to control fire ants, and they might be successful because they are kind of a closed system. Taiwan, China, I don't know about China so much, but for sure Japan, especially not mainland Japan, but the islands, they've put in a lot of money to try to manage them and eradicate fire ants from those areas. So if you lived on an island, I think you could eradicate them. But if you're part of the United States and you're connected to other countries, there's just no way that we can manage fire ants. We can't totally eradicate them. And if you did, you'd have to nuke everybody's front yard and backyard. If you think about it, it's really easy to do like an eradication program for the boll weevil in cotton, because you know that they're only in cotton, and you can force cotton farmers to treat for the boll weevil. But we can't force everybody on the planet who has a patch of land to do something against fire ants. We have very effective pesticides to control them, but they reinvade very easily. So while you know that you might treat your yard, if your neighbors are not, you always end up with a fire ant issue. And it's just extremely expensive. There's just no way that we could bring in enough funds to try to control fire ants. I think there's other pests that are probably more important to put those funds towards. So, you might be asking yourself, how do I get fire ants? Well, you can get them naturally through mating flights. So right before a rainstorm, about 100% humidity, they will take off out of their nest and they will mate. And then you will usually, if you have a pool, you've definitely seen these, you find them all on the pool. After they've mated, the queens drop and she drops her wings. In real life, if she doesn't land in the pool, she'll land on the ground. Her wings will drop. Her body will kind of use those muscles for energy. They'll reabsorb it. She'll crawl into the ground, and then she'll start laying eggs and feeding those babies, and then start this big old colony. Well, we also get them through floods. They can float on top of the water. And when I was in grad school, if we needed like clean colonies of fire ants, we would put them in these big shoe boxes. If we wanted them without all the dirt that they're in, we would drip them. We'd dig up a nest and we put it in a 5-gallon bucket, and we'd slowly drip until the water rose above the soil, and they would float above it also. And we'd have the whole colony, the queens and the workers and all their babies would be in there. So they can survive when it floods. And that makes them, if you've ever heard of like the raspberry crazy ant or the tawny crazy ant, they just drown. And that's a good thing. You can have geographical barriers. Fire ants don't care. They just go wherever they want to go. And then we can move them too. Anytime you get soil or mulch brought in, you might be bringing fire ants in. You move and you bring a potted plant from one state to another, or one city to county to another, then you can often move fire ants from one spot to the next. If you do those B&B bags, the burlapped bags, they love to get around those roots because it's nice and pliable, and it's easy for them to move that soil. So you plant a tree, you might get a fire ant, you move into a new community, the area could have no fire ants, but as soon as you put in soil and landscaping and grass, we will always detect fire ants. We've done that study a number of times. It's really interesting. You'll collect none of them, and then as soon as the landscaping comes in, even if it's just turf, you now all of a sudden have them. So inside of that fire ant colony is a caste system, just like termites and just like honeybees. And so they're really sophisticated and really kind of interesting, I think, that this social system, they're considered truly social or eusocial insects. You have queens, and in a fire ant colony, we have multiple queens. You can have hundreds of egg-laying queens, each laying 2,000 eggs a day. So you don't want to just spray for some workers that are crawling around. You have to control the queens in order to kill the actual colony. There's reproductives, which are males and females that are winged and going to become queens. You don't have kings in these colonies. The males mate and die. They don't live much past that. Their purpose is to reproduce, and that's really it. And then the vast majority of the colony is made up of those workers who can sting you and are the ones that you hate so much. But you have to kill the queen to make sure you kill the workers. And then there's what we call brood, and that's all of their little babies. So they have a life cycle like a butterfly does, where they lay an egg, it turns into a larva, turns into a pupa, and then will become an adult. The larvae are the only ones in the colony that can eat solid food. So the workers bring food back, feed it to the larva, massage their bellies, and they vomit it back up again, and then they feed it to everybody else. And I'm telling you this because, not to gross you out at dinner time, but because it'll make sense when we talk about how baits work for controlling fire ants. And then also one other thing I would just point out is the sizing of the workers can vary from very small to very large. So I get a lot of times people saying, I don't think there are fire ants in my house because they're too tiny, they're more like a sugar ant. But you can see they can be about as tiny as a sugar ant, or they'll say it's too big, it's got to be a carpenter ant. They can vary in size. It's based on how much food they get, the age of the colony, the time of year. There's a number of different variables, but they have multiple sized workers all within that same colony. I don't remember why I have this picture in here, but I think it's just really to show you kind of how cavernous those mounds are. So this is obviously a dead fire ant mound that's kind of dried out. There's a lot happening below the surface. What you see above the surface is like the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot happening underneath. I hope I've thrown a picture in, I haven't. If you are really into fire ants, you can Google a professor, a researcher from University of Florida named, forget his first name, but his last name is Schinkel, T-S-H, Inkle. And he is kind of a really interesting man. He stopped really doing research and then started making a name for himself by excavating fire ant mounds. He would find them, and then he would pour liquid aluminum. So he would boil the aluminum, liquefy it, make it go into the fire ant mounds, and he was able to show how expansive all of those little tunnels are that go everywhere. You see the mound here, but everything is on these little pockets all to the side like little satellites. So when you treat a mound, you're only treating a tiny little portion of it. You're not getting all of these other areas where there could be queens and eggs being laid, and you have no idea how deep they get also. So the mound is just a teeny tiny portion of them. They are so much further into that ground. Another reason why when I talk about using baits, they are oftentimes a better option for you, because you drench that mound, all you got was that little center part. They pop up 3 feet away and you say, I didn't do anything, I just moved them. You did something, you just didn't kill the whole thing. You ended up splitting them and almost forming different colonies from one gigantic colony. So there's different options for fire ants. And what I like about fire ants is they're pretty darn easy to kill. They're really not that difficult, but your options are baits, which is food for the fire ants. There's granules that you generally put out and water in or allow the soil to absorb it, and it kind of makes a barrier. You can use dusts, which like ortho, if you're familiar, it's really, really stinky. It has a terrible odor to it. And then drenches would be like something that's liquid. So we have tons of options for fire ants. And really there hasn't been a whole lot going on research-wise on fire ants and management, because the products we have work so well that there's no companies really coming up with new things. So most of the products that are on the market now were on the market 15 years ago. I prefer, and through Extension and A&M, we always recommend using baits for controlling fire ants for a number of reasons. One reason is that it's the more environmentally friendly way to control fire ants, because it is, it's like corn grit soaked in soybean oil, and soybean oil is the attractant. They would like to go after that greasy stuff. And then it's also soaked in a pesticide. So it's fairly target specific, meaning that other ants don't really like oily stuff. And so while other ants might pick it up, if fire ants are in the area, they are not going to let any other ant eat that food. And so they will take it out of the environment, take it into their nest, and feed it to everybody. Even those mounds that aren't popped up, the teeny tiny ones, or the ones that are, it's just so dry that they're not really noticeable, they will get controlled as well, because they still have to eat also. So they'll take that back into the nest. Baits are generally more economical, especially if you have large areas that you've got to treat. If you're on an acre or more, or you have an acre or more that you have to control, they're way cheaper than going and drenching each individual mound. You can broadcast it, or you can spot treat it. It takes about 2 weeks to see results. So some people might think that that is fast, but a lot of people would say, no, that's not immediate. But there's a method to that madness that I'll explain in a little bit. The cons are that you don't get any residual. So once the ants eat it, if new ants move in, they're still just going to be there. And that's good. You really don't want that bait sitting out and being an effective pesticide for a really long time. But it can also be pretty easily ruined. So if you allow it to get wet, you don't want to eat soggy toast. They don't want to eat soggy bait. So you want it to be nice and dry. If it gets too hot, the oil can eke out of it. So it needs to be fairly fresh for it to be very effective. And like I mentioned, you don't really get immediate results from it. You got to wait about 2 weeks. And the reason why is because you put out that bait and the workers find it and they know it's food and they take it back into their colony. Well, they can't eat it. We know they can't, but if they suck up some of that pesticide, it can't kill them on the way back, because you didn't kill anybody but a handful of workers. And you've got hundreds of queens laying 2,000 eggs. She doesn't care if you killed a handful of her babies. She'll pop more out that night. They have to take it back and feed it to the larva, which consume it, partially digest it, and then regurgitate it. They can't die, or you just killed off the larva and you have all these eggs that will just replace those guys. So the larvae eat it, spit it up, the workers take it, they'll feed on it and feed it to their queen, but the queen has tasters that will taste her food. So if all her workers are dying from this food, she won't eat it. So it's got to take a long time. It can't work immediately. It's got to make its way to the queens. And then that mound might have all these little satellite sections, all these little rooms in her castle where there's other queens laying eggs. It's got to make its way all to those places to kill off every single queen. So you have to be patient with baits. They rarely work super duper fast. But once you kill the queen, that's when you kill the colony. And that's the only way that you can effectively eliminate a fire ant nest, is by knocking out all of your queens. And there's a couple of different types of baits. There are those that I put them in one of two categories. It's either a fast acting bait, which would be like your Amdro products. It kills workers and queens. They eat it and they croak and they die. Or there's other baits that are called insect growth regulators, and they mimic an insect's molting hormone. So they will either she will lay eggs that never hatch, or the immatures, the larvae, kind of come out deformed and they never make it to becoming viable adults. So it's kind of like birth control for fire ants. It's much slower acting because you have to wait until all of the workers die off. You know, your babies are not becoming adults, but the adults that are still there have to die off on their own. So it takes like 4 to 6 weeks for that to work, but your residual is generally longer for whatever reason. So some people like that because, my hormones are not the same as an insect's hormones. Your dog's hormones are certainly not the same either. Other insects have the same type of hormones that an ant does. And I don't know why they would, but if a bee or a butterfly and they would not ate it, then it would affect them. But they're not going after that kind of food because they don't like that protein. They don't like the oil. They like other stuff. So your beneficials in general are not affected by your insect growth regulator type baits. And this is kind of what some of those look like. So most of them that are fast acting affect their nervous system. So they just kind of, shoot too much signal and then they die. They get exhausted and they die. Abamectin is that Ascend product. Indoxacarb is another one. That's Advion. So when your pest control guy comes in, he might use that because it's very fast acting. It's actually the fastest acting bait that's out there. If you like if you want to stick with organic, there is Fertilome puts out Come and Get It, and that has spinosad in it. So we do have an organic bait option. That is also the only bait that I am aware of that you can apply in a vegetable garden. So you can put your other stuff around it, but you can't, it's not labeled for inside of the vegetable garden, but spinosad is. And then actually Fipronil might be the Advion products. I can't remember what indoxacarb is called again, what its brand name is. And then Amdro is kind of it's been around forever, and it's always the go-to. It's what you see on the shelves at Lowe's and Home Depot, and that affects their metabolism, kind of shuts down their mitochondria, so they essentially starve. And then you might hear about using boric acid. That's a stomach poison, we believe, is how that acts on them. And you would mix that with a little bit of peanut butter because they like that protein, that greasy stuff, but don't ever use it outside because boric acid is, it can affect the kidneys of wildlife and birds, reptiles, mammals. Inside is labeled for use inside because you can hide it from your dogs and your cats and your kids. You don't want to consume that stuff. But small animals outside, if they ate a small amount, it could be harmful for them. You'd have to eat a lot of it. I still wouldn't recommend it, but the larger the animal, the more you have to eat for it to be really harmful. Outside, you can't control what's coming after that stuff. And then all these little insect growth regulators here, there's a lot of different options for you. I'd say Extinguish is probably the one that is the most readily available. And some of these products might not even be on the market anymore. But for sure, I know for sure that methoprene, the Extinguish products, are out there. Usually with these insect growth regulators, you have to buy huge amounts. Like that bag is a 25-pound bag, and that will cover 17 acres. So most people don't need that much. You're going to buy what you find at Lowe's and Home Depot in a small container that you can put out in your front yard and your backyard. If you have a small space and you go to your co-op or your feed store and you do get like one of these products, get the smallest one you can, unless you live on a lot of acreage that you're going to be treating the fire ants for. There's also a hopper blend. One of my coworkers, and I would say mentors when I first started with Extension, he's since retired, he helped develop this product, and it's Extinguish Plus. It's basically Amdro mixed with Extinguish. And so you get the quick knockdown, but you also get the longer residual in case for whatever reason they didn't get enough of that initial pesticide to get sick. At least the queen's not laying eggs. And they used to, I don't know if it's still out there, but Amdro Fire Strike was the same thing, but meant for like homeowner use. Extinguish Plus is usually just in larger amounts. So what homeowners like is to see stuff on the ground. We like to put it out and know it's out there. But really all you're buying is more corn grit, just so you can see it. You're not buying more pesticide. It's not working any better. So it sounds opposite, but the pro versions, you might put half of a cup for your front yard and half a cup for your backyard. Whereas the stuff you get off the shelf, you're using the whole container for your front yard and your backyard, because we just like to see it. We don't think it works unless we can see it on the ground. And the way that you apply these baits, it really doesn't matter what you purchased, but the way that you apply it, I think, is incredibly important. It always needs to be fresh. You want to open it and it should smell like potato chips. And I know that sounds really weird, but if you open it and it smells like potato chips, it's fresh. If it smells like pesticide, or to me, it always smells plasticky, melted plastic, it's bad. Don't even put it out. Throw it in the trash. Read the label and see what they say to do with it, but it's probably trash and you can probably dump it in the trash can. So read your label for rates so that you know how to apply and where to apply. If you have a smaller piece of land and you don't have a lot of fire ants, then you might as well just treat each individual mound if you like to. And what that guy is doing in that picture is the worst way to treat for fire ants, because the foragers who are looking for food are not looking for food on top of their house. They're going away to look for it. So you want to apply it in a ring, because what they find on top of their house, they usually consider to be trash. So they may not even pick up a morsel of your bait if you apply it that way. So do it as a ring. Never, ever, ever water it in. Make sure it's very, very dry, because it's food. It's not like going into the soil or anything. If you have maybe more than 5 mounds per acre, then it becomes more economical for you to throw it out as a broadcast treatment or use your little hand fertilizer and crank it out, as opposed to walking to each and every individual mound. And then just remember, just because you count mounds, that doesn't necessarily mean those are all the fire ants you have. They can be underneath things, they can be under your driveway, they can be hiding, especially when it's very hot and there's no rain that's forcing them, pushing them up. So, we always say treat fire ants in the fall, because if you treat in the fall, you will have less of them in the spring. And this goes back a long way when, we had a lot of funding to just teach people about fire ants. We had this whole campaign about treat in the fall, you'll have few fire ants in the spring. We had stickers that had the ant that was tackled. We had all this stuff, bookmarks and all sorts of silly stuff in our office to try to encourage people to treat in the fall. But the point is that if you treat in the fall, when their population is on the down decline, you'll have less of them in the springtime. You treat in the spring, their population is on the rise. And so you may have to treat spring, summer, and then fall. But if you get on a regimen where you're treating in the fall, that may be the only time you're ever treating for fire ants. And so you're using very little pesticide. And that's kind of the ultimate goal, right? Is to reduce the amount of pesticide use that you're putting out into the environment. So when you apply the baits is important. I kind of mentioned this before. Make sure that it's fresh. It should smell like potato chips. If you buy a large amount and you don't use all of it, if you can keep it somewhere in an air conditioned or at least climate controlled so it doesn't get super duper hot, it will last you a lot longer. Stick it in the freezer if you can. Make sure you have a window where you don't have rain for about 48 hours. So 24 hours prior and 24 hours after. You want the ground to not be saturated and really gross and wet. You want it to be nice and dry. And then they should get it out of the environment within 12 hours, but give yourself a whole day just in case they don't find it. We say 75 degrees, but they'll forage in a sunny spot way less temperature than that. And if you want to know, like if they're actively looking for food, if maybe you're concerned and you want to make sure you either kill them or you just want to make sure they're what's there to pick up the bait, throw out a little sliver of a hot dog, a potato chip, a Cheeto, anything that's super duper greasy. Go back in about 45 minutes, and if there's ants on it, it's probably fire ants. And one trick is that if you blow on them, they get ticked off and they'll scatter all over the place. So if you see that happening, then you probably have fire ants. If you put a flag in your hot dog and they crawl up the pole, then they also have fire ants as well. So fire ants are funny because they just act odd. And then the way that you apply it can be a number of different ways. I like using just those little handheld spreader type things. I'm just sorry, I keep getting the same number calling me, and I'm making sure that it's not one of you guys calling me to say, we can't hear what you're saying. So there's a little handheld spreaders that work really great. If you have a big area.
I can hear you very good.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
This was like, why is this number calling me 3 times in a row? There's backpack spreaders. If you have a lot of land, there's these herd spreaders, which are cedars. And this guy who owned this company modified it to be a bait blower or a bait spreader. So if you hate fire ants, I have a guy in Atascosa County who he just bales hay right now. That's all he does. But he's developed his own irrigation system, and the fire ants are attracted to the moisture, and it clogs up his equipment as he's starting to cut that hay. And so he bought himself one of those because he has acres that he has to treat for fire ants to make his life easier. But you probably don't need it for your half-acre lot or something like that. But it's kind of a neat deal. It's just a big chute. It's a trash can, and it has an agitator at the bottom. And so as you're driving, it agitates and it shoots it out either as a big swath, or it has a chute on it with a blower, and it will shoot it like into front yards. We used to do that when we did community-wide programs. So if you have a lot of acreage, maybe it's worth you purchasing that funny little thing. You hook it up to the hitch of your car, and your lights make it go on and off. So if you can work with your neighbors, that's always the best way to do it, to control fire ants, because you can control them all day long in your yard, but you can't control what your neighbors do, and their ants will just move over. So if you in the middle can get your two buddies on either side of you to treat at the same time you do, you will have less fire ants, and even they will, unless they get the other people on the other side of them to do it as well. But you get longer results if you can get the whole community to go. I have a coworker in Travis County, and she, for like, I think she's on year 17 of working with this neighborhood, and every fall they treat for fire ants, and she it has been extremely successful. They find lots of native ants, a huge number of species of native ants, and very rarely do they find fire ants. And they've, you know, you will always still get them, but what they've done is they've increased the fauna, the different species that are present in that neighborhood, which is kind of a cool wildlife, or, you know, population density story. And then, you know, if all else fails, you can always do what other people do. They always say they put gasoline on it and light it on fire. That gasoline's not going to burn underneath the ground, so you're never going to kill your fire ants that way. When I was a young agent, first starting out like 15 years ago, I had a woman who called me and said, I heard that you know, gasoline will kill fire ants, and I have fire ants under my deck, and I need to know how much I need to pour underneath there to light it on fire. So the world is full of people who don't think very well. So don't use gasoline, and don't light it on fire. There's other options that are less environmentally toxic. And then I'll leave these two little websites up here on here for you. We had a change in some of our entomology websites, so I'm not sure that the fireants.tamu.edu site is still active, but there is also that eXtension website, eXtension.org, and that's kind of a cool website. If it's still, I believe it's all still up there, but it had a lot of information from a lot of us that did fire ant research from all different states, putting all of our information together. And somewhere on that site, there's kind of a think map. So it will ask you questions, and at the end, it will spit out what you should use and how you should, like, should you use a drench, should you use a dust, you know, what you should use, or even what bait to use to make your life a little bit easier, so you know what works best for your situation. And that is not our phone number. That's missing a digit, but that's our old number up there. So don't even call right now, because you can't even get through. No one's at the office. But if you have questions, definitely feel free to shoot me an email and email me. That's the best way to reach me lately, with everybody working from home. And then if you have questions, I guess you can unmute yourself, right, and just shout out.
Yeah, I'll go through and try to unmute everyone, but if you muted yourself, I can't unmute you. So if you need to ask a question, just unmute yourself.
When you say fall, what part of fall? How early or how late?
It really doesn't matter. We say fall because they're on the decline. They're getting, in the wintertime, their population dips really low because they don't have food, and they don't want to have to feed a bunch of babies. But, you know, September, October,
Okay.
November even, because we stay pretty warm. You could even treat and another reason, fall and spring are great times, because that's when it's wettest, and that's when the fire ants are up higher, and so they're more likely to pick up the baits and back into the nest.
Molly, I have a question. I'm not sure if they're fire ants. I never have mounds, but they're underneath the soil. So I don't see them unless it's under a pot, or if I dig, if I, you know, go to pull up some grass or something, and they're all in there.
Do they sting you?
Well, I have never put my hand in there. They're real tiny.
I mean, we have so many different species of ants. If they don't, you know, even fire ants have some positive aspects, right? They aerate the soil. They reduce fleas.
They kill my plants. They get into the roots and kill the plants.
There's something else probably going on, because ants, so that's probably not fire ants in the pot. It might be somebody else, but there are no ants that feed on roots, that feed on, the only ones that will strip leaves are leafcutter ants, but that doesn't sound like those guys. So I think you've got something else happening. But they're actually good in those pots because they're aerating the soil really well for you.
They kill the plant.
But I'm saying I think you've got something else happening that's killing the plant because there's no ants that eat roots.
Okay.
Molly, I have a question.
Okay.
What do you think of the concoction to kill fire ants that includes orange oil and Dawn soap?
So both of those things, even independently, will kill or can be an insecticide against any insect, really. I guess the Dawn maybe makes it stickier. Maybe that's why that's added to it, the soap. But orange oil or orange extract is a really good pesticide for fire ants or any insect, but it's also a really good herbicide. So you don't want to do it like in your really nice lush, lawn. We did it on a sports field once, and the coach called me like 3 weeks later and said, "Can you come out here and see what you did?" And we had dead spots everywhere we put it out. Don't do it in your lawn, and maybe don't do it like in your veggie garden or something like that. But if it's a place that you don't really care about, then it definitely can kill them. But it's the same thing with the drench, right? You don't know that you killed everybody. You just really drenched one section. So smaller colonies, it can be more effective. Larger ones, they might pop up a few feet away.
Thank you.
You said the bait is ruined by sunlight. How much sunlight does it take to ruin the bait? When do you put it out? Midday or evening or what?
So in the summertime, they're more nocturnal. So it's better to put it out like right now as the sun's going down and the day is cooling off a little bit. Well, it's not quite 7, and yesterday it was like 9 something before the sun totally went down. So in the evening, in the dusk time, when it's cooler, you can really do it all day long. Morning is not great because it's real dewy and you might want to wait till things dry out. But it's really just direct sunlight that will heat that bait up so that the oil kind of oozes out of it. So you wouldn't do it at 2 o'clock today. You wouldn't have done it at 2 o'clock today when it was super hot and super sunny.
Molly, what are there any natural predators for the fire ants? What's going to eat them?
Well, I mean, lizards and birds and things like that will eat them. There are some microsporidium that are in the soil that will infect them. There are phorid flies that have been released that will lay their eggs in their heads, and then the head falls off. So there are some natural enemies. Because they're not native, they don't have a whole lot of natural enemies here than they do. Like, you don't hear about them being that much of an issue in Brazil and Paraguay because they have things that help bring them into check. We just don't have those here. They're non-native things generally don't have a lot of natural enemies.
Thank you.
I think there's a paper that says that purple martins eat the queens when they're in the sky mating. Is that true?
I'm sure that they would, especially when you have huge mating flights, like where you've had an extended period of drought and then really good rain, then you have so many of them up in the sky. So I wouldn't doubt that. I think, don't purple martins feed during the day?
Yes.
Then if it's a daytime flight, then I'm positive that they would find, because they're pretty juicy. I mean, they're pretty big ants, so they'd give them a pretty good diet if they ate enough of them. Any other questions, you guys?
Is there any truth that if you have fire ants, you won't have ticks?
You generally have fewer ticks and fleas when you have fire ants, so there's that benefit to them. If you hate ticks and fleas, then you might want to keep fire ants around. Someone messaged me, what do fire ants eat? they eat other insects, anything with protein. They're not really sugar feeding ants. They are more of they love greasy protein stuff, which is why fire ant bait is its own thing as opposed to like, sugar ant bait or even carpenter ant bait.
So Molly, if you have a ant inside on your kitchen counter, that's probably the sugar ants then, not the fire ants, I'm guessing.
It could be, or it could be rover ants, or I mean, I've had times where people have had major infestations of fire ants inside their house.
Oh.
It usually happens when in the summertime when the weather's just really, really weird. So you can have them inside. If you ever wonder what your ant is, send it to me. You can well, here, I'll stick that one up there. My email address again. You can email me and I can give you our mailing address and you can stick it in the mail and I can try to identify it for you if you're wondering exactly what ant it is. And sometimes it's really important. It often is very important to know exactly what your ant is because, like I said, some prefer certain baits, and some you don't ever want to spray for. You only want to use baits, or you'll make them bud. So you want to know who you're dealing with so you know exactly how to control them. Somebody else also asked if nematodes from the nurseries kill fire ants. Yes, they can. The thing about nematodes is they're so sensitive to, and they need to be in a very, very, very wet situations. So we just in Texas are so incredibly dry that usually by the time you put the nematodes out, it's not real effective. But if we had a really wet spring or a really wet fall, then it would be a great option. They just kind of, they probably won't kill off a whole colony, but what they might do is stress them out enough that you don't notice that they're there.
I had a bad infestation in a pot with a berry. I think it was a blackberry. I treated it with spinosad, a 2-gallon drench, and I did it like 3 times and it never killed them. Then I finally got someone to come and get it, and that seemed to kill it. Why didn't the drench work? It's rated for it, and it says it should.
It could have been that, was the pot on soil or was it like on a concrete pad?
Concrete pad.
Maybe it just didn't, I don't know. It doesn't make sense because you would think you would drench it well enough it would get all throughout that pot. But just, I don't know. They're tough. They're tough little things.
Well, thank you so much, Molly. If no one else has any questions, I know you've had a very long and busy day, so we won't keep you, but we sure appreciate this.
No problem. Thank you guys for logging on.
Excellent.
Thank you, Molly.
Good luck with
Thank
your
you.
this summer.
Thank you, thank you.
You'll
Thank
probably
you.
have some new ants to
Thank
identify
you.
from this. Thank you, Molly.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.